She was yanked from her seat with a sneer and a lie, her skin the only thing questioned louder than her boarding pass. First class cabin. Dozens watching. No one said a word. A black woman accused of fraud before she spoke, humiliated like she didn't belong, like she never could. The flight attendant didn't whisper. She announced it loud and smug, as if catching a criminal. But there was no mistake, no confusion, just bias, sharp as a blade, wrapped in a fake smile. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She let them write the story, play their parts, dig their own grave with every cold dismissal. Because what none of them knew, what no one even imagined, was that the woman they tried to break wasn't a victim. She was the storm waiting in silence. If that stopped you in your tracks, hit like, subscribe for the rest of this true thriller, and drop a comment. What would you have done if you were her? And where are you watching from? Vanessa Brooks moved through the terminal with deliberate calm, blending professionalism and poise in every step. Her tailored navy suit, worn with understated jewelry and quiet confidence, marked her not as someone trying to stand out, but as someone who had earned her place. She wasn't in a rush, and she didn't need to check the gate number again. She had memorized every detail. Her boarding pass was printed and folded into her passport holder, and her phone had the digital version, too. She reached gate 41A just as the agent called Group 1 for boarding. The line for first class was short. A silver-haired man with a designer briefcase walked ahead of her, getting a quick scan and a chirpy welcome. Behind him, Vanessa stepped forward and met the gate agent's eyes, Deborah Hale. Deborah wore her uniform with stiffness, her tight smile controlled, and her tone sugar-laced with hidden thorns. She didn't greet Vanessa right away. Instead, she glanced her up and down, subtly, but enough to be noticed. Vanessa extended her boarding pass. Deborah accepted it with hesitation, pausing before scanning. She tilted her head and asked, "Are you in the right lane, ma'am?" Her tone wasn't questioning out of concern. It was layered with disbelief. Vanessa replied without a flicker of doubt, "Yes. Group 1. First class. Seat 1A." Deborah's smile grew tighter. "May I see your ID as well?" Vanessa handed it over without comment. Deborah examined both items slowly, too slowly, before scanning the pass. The machine beeped affirmatively. Deborah handed it back. "Thank you. Just making sure everything's in order," she said, tone clipped. Vanessa offered no reply and proceeded down the jet bridge. Her stomach was calm, but the encounter scratched at the edges of her composure. Inside the plane, the hum of quiet conversations filled the first-class cabin. She walked to her seat, 1A by the window, and slid her carry-on into the overhead compartment. As she sat down, she noticed the flight attendants further down the aisle, chatting with passengers, offering drinks, adjusting headsets. No one acknowledged her. She fastened her belt, pulled out her phone, and waited. But her solitude was soon interrupted. Deborah Hale stepped aboard, clipboard in hand, walking straight toward Vanessa. She didn't smile this time. "Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass again?" she asked. Vanessa turned slightly. "You've already checked it." "Yes, but we're double-checking assignments. There may have been a late change." Vanessa handed it over, watching as Deborah scrutinized the pass again. Her brow furrowed as she tapped at her device. Then she looked up. "Unfortunately, we have a seating issue. It appears your seat was double-booked. We'll have to move you." Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not possible. My seat was booked 3 weeks ago, confirmed multiple times." Deborah didn't blink. "I understand, but the system sometimes auto-adjusts. These things happen. I'll get you another seat. In first class." Vanessa asked, though she knew the answer. Deborah shook her head. "We're fully booked. We'll need to move you to economy. It's just a 2-hour flight." It was actually 3 hours and 55 minutes. Vanessa exhaled through her nose. The nearby passengers pretended not to listen, but couldn't help themselves. One man lowered his newspaper. Another woman adjusted her earbuds without pressing play. Vanessa rose from her seat. She lifted her carry-on from the bin, nodded once, and followed Deborah back through the cabin. The further she walked, the more eyes followed. She was placed in a tight seat near the back, flanked by a teenage boy tapping rapidly on his phone and an older woman who smelled strongly of perfume. Deborah didn't apologize. She handed Vanessa a plastic water cup and said, "We appreciate your understanding." Then she walked off. Vanessa sat, placed her bag under the seat in front of her, and folded her hands in her lap. She stared ahead, face impassive. The seatbelt sign blinked. The engines rumbled to life. The plane rolled toward the runway. No one came to speak to her. No one returned to explain. And back in seat 1A, a white passenger now sat comfortably, sipping orange juice and scrolling through emails, unaware or uninterested in whose seat he'd taken. Or perhaps very aware. Deborah Hale returned to first class, walking the aisle with an ease she hadn't shown minutes before. She smiled at the man in 1C. She joked with the couple in 2A and 2B. She passed right by 1A and didn't glance back once. Vanessa said nothing for the next hour. She didn't touch the water. She didn't ask for anything. She sat silently, thoughts racing but unreadable on her face. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to her, but the coldness of it, the calculated public demotion, still bruised something inside her. She kept her eyes on the seat back ahead of her. She knew this flight would be long, not just in hours, but in what it was about to reveal. She wasn't angry, not yet, but humiliation clung to her like sweat in a sealed cabin. No one asked her how she was. She adjusted her blazer slightly, wiped an invisible speck from her lap, and tried to breathe evenly. Her fingers tapped against her thigh in an unconscious rhythm, trying to reset the clock in her head to keep the situation logical, grounded, containable. Yet she couldn't shake the image of seat 1A, her seat, vanishing behind her as she walked the length of the aircraft. She had paid for that seat, booked it directly, selected it deliberately. It wasn't just a seat. It was a position, a symbol of who she had become after years of silent effort. It was a place earned, not gifted. The turbulence that followed wasn't from the sky. It came from the ground. 10 minutes into the flight, the meal cart rolled through first class with its array of warm bread, chilled wine, and silver service. Vanessa knew this not because she could see it, but because Deborah's voice, lively and smooth, drifted through the intercom with cheerful announcements about the menu and the curated wine pairings for the exclusive forward cabin. Her voice carried more hospitality than it had ever shown Vanessa. No apologies, no updates, nothing about the seating error had been clarified. The passengers around her were content, adjusting their pillows, flipping through in-flight magazines, plugging in earbuds. None of them knew what had happened. Or, if they did, none thought it worth caring about. The man next to Vanessa had fallen asleep, his mouth slightly open, head lolled to the side. On her left, the teenager beside the window wore large headphones and bobbed his head to a rhythm she couldn't hear. Her row was sealed in silence, invisible to the activity up front. She pressed the call button. It blinked orange. A few minutes passed. No one came. She pressed it again. 10 more minutes. Finally, a young flight attendant approached. Her smile was nervous, her gaze avoiding direct contact. Vanessa asked calmly, "Can you please tell me why I was moved from seat 1A?" The attendant glanced at the blinking button light, then back at Vanessa. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I wasn't part of that conversation. I can check with the lead if you'd like." Vanessa nodded. "Please." The attendant left, never returned. She watched the minutes tick by. Time didn't move fast enough to dull the insult. Her dignity felt caught in a holding pattern, circling above reality, waiting for permission to land. Somewhere around the second hour of flight, she decided to stand up and stretch. Her legs were cramping. She walked quietly to the back of the cabin near the galley, hoping for some space. As she stood near the emergency exit door, Deborah walked by, pushing a half-empty beverage cart. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither said anything. Then Deborah spoke. "You doing all right back here?" Her voice was chipper, as if the last interaction between them had never occurred. Vanessa didn't smile. "I never received an explanation." Deborah tilted her head. "Explanation? About why I was moved?" Deborah shifted her stance, still holding the cart. "Like I said, it was a system adjustment. Seat 1A was flagged for reassignment. Sometimes there are double bookings, especially with elite status passengers. I thought I explained that earlier. You did, Vanessa said slowly, but not clearly. Deborah gave a slight shrug. Look, I didn't design the software. I just follow what the manifest tells me. These things happen all the time. Vanessa didn't reply. She looked at the side of the beverage cart, where the metal was scratched and dented. Deborah added, "Besides, the guy up there now? He's a priority executive for one of our major partners. Those seats sometimes shift last minute. It's out of my hands." Vanessa stared at her for a beat. "And I wasn't a priority?" Deborah smirked. "Don't take it personally. That's how these programs work. Someone's always going to be disappointed." She reached for a plastic cup, filled it with ginger ale, and handed it over. "Here, on the house." Vanessa took it without thanks. She turned and walked back to her seat, the bubbling drink in hand, the air thicker around her. She sat down, placed the cup on the tray, and stared out the window. Her reflection looked calm, but beneath it, her thoughts spiraled. There was no double booking. There was no executive override. There was a woman named Deborah who had seen a black woman in seat 1A and decided she didn't belong there. 2 rows up, she noticed an older man looking at her, watching with a frown on his face. She couldn't read whether it was curiosity, pity, or irritation. When their eyes met, he looked away. A half hour later, the food cart reached her section. Sandwiches wrapped in crinkled plastic, pretzel bags, ginger ale from a can. Nothing warm, nothing like what was offered up front. The same attendant from before offered her a choice of turkey or ham. Vanessa selected ham and took it with a quiet nod. No eye contact, no effort to disguise the difference in service. The curtain dividing first class and economy remained closed. As she opened the sandwich wrapper, a familiar scent of reheated bread wafted up, making her stomach churn. She had no appetite. She placed the sandwich down and folded her hands again. She sat like that for nearly 20 minutes, unmoving, her fingers tightening with every bounce of turbulence. When the trash collection came, she passed back the untouched meal. The attendant asked, "Everything okay with the food?" Vanessa replied, "It's fine." But it wasn't. By the time the captain announced descent, Vanessa's body was stiff. Her throat was dry, not from thirst, but from the effort it had taken to remain silent for the entire flight. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't caused a scene. She hadn't demanded anything more than fairness. And for that, she had been labeled difficult, disruptive, expendable. Deborah Hale walked down the aisle once more, this time with landing cards and final instructions. She passed Vanessa without so much as a glance. Not a word, not a nod. It was as if Vanessa had ceased to exist the moment she left first class. Every time she exhaled, she tried to release the tension that had lodged there since the gate, since the seat reassignment, since the way Deborah Hale had dismissed her with a customer service smile that never masked the contempt beneath. The cabin had entered cruise altitude, but Vanessa felt nothing resembling calm. There was no turbulence in the air, but there was plenty inside her. She had held back every instinct to demand what she had paid for. She had stayed still, reserved, composed. She had not asked for special treatment. She had asked only for what was hers. And now, here she sat, punished by silence, buried in irrelevance, as if her very presence had been an inconvenience to correct. Her throat was dry. The air in the back of the cabin was stuffy, slightly stale, and the lack of movement made it worse. She reached for the call button and pressed it once. A small chime sounded, followed by the familiar orange glow above her seat. She waited. No one came. She waited longer, hands resting on her thighs, watching as an attendant served coffee 3 rows ahead. She pressed the button again. Still no response. After 8 minutes, she finally saw a young flight attendant approaching. The woman's face was blank as she leaned toward Vanessa's row, lips tight and voice flat. "Yes." Vanessa kept her tone neutral. "May I please have some water?" The attendant nodded, turned, and walked away without a word. She returned a few minutes later with a plastic cup, half filled, condensation clinging to the outside, and set it on Vanessa's tray with an air of mechanical indifference. There was no smile, no gesture of empathy or acknowledgement, just a silent delivery and quick retreat. Vanessa sipped the lukewarm water slowly, each swallow scraping slightly against the dryness in her throat. It wasn't just hydration she was after. It was the principle, the small act of being seen, acknowledged, respected. She didn't get any of that. In the row across from her, a woman had just received a ginger ale with a lime wedge. Her interaction with the attendant had ended with a smile and a joke about the turbulence. The contrast wasn't subtle. Vanessa had known this game long before she stepped onto this flight. It was death by 1,000 cuts. No single action outrageous enough to protest, but all of them together forming an undeniable pattern. A careful orchestration of exclusion designed to humiliate without appearing hostile. A short while later, she stood to stretch again. She walked carefully toward the back, passing rows of passengers immersed in magazines, headphones, and conversations. As she neared the galley, she heard voices. Not loud, not intended for everyone, but audible enough. She paused behind the partition curtain, still out of view. It was Deborah. Her voice was unmistakable, cool, clipped, and laced with judgment. "I don't know what her deal is," Deborah was saying. "She's been pressing the call button like we're her private butlers. She's in economy now, but still acting entitled. I mean, seriously? It's a cup of water, not a demand for champagne." A second voice, softer, replied, "Wasn't she supposed to be in first?" Deborah scoffed. "Yeah, and I handled it. We had to prioritize a loyal partner executive, so she got bumped. Happens all the time. But you know how some people are. They can't handle being told no. Always got something to prove." Vanessa stood still, her breath shallow. The words hit their mark, not because they surprised her, but because they confirmed what she already knew. The reassignment wasn't random. It wasn't a software glitch. It was a decision, a choice. And now, it was being laughed about like she was a child who had thrown a tantrum over a lost toy. She turned and returned to her seat without confronting them. She sat back down and stared straight ahead, the screen now dark in front of her. She had no interest in watching anything. She was watching everything. As the cart moved through the aisle again, Deborah herself passed by this time, distributing snack packs and drinks. She reached Vanessa's row, paused, and looked directly at her, the fake smile returning like a mask sliding into place. "Anything I can get you?" she asked, voice honey-sweet but brittle. Vanessa shook her head. "No, thank you." Her voice was calm, but behind her words was the echo of everything she wanted to say. She wanted to ask how someone in her position could still believe she had the right to mock, diminish, and erase another human being with such impunity. She wanted to ask how often this happened to people who couldn't defend themselves. She wanted to ask what Deborah would do if the roles were reversed. But she said nothing. Deborah lingered a moment longer, then moved on. As she passed the next row, Vanessa overheard her whisper to another attendant, "At least she's quiet now." The words weren't for her, but they might as well have been shouted. The man in the aisle seat beside her shifted awkwardly. Vanessa noticed. He had heard it too. He glanced at her, opened his mouth slightly as if to say something, then stopped himself. He turned back to his magazine, feigning distraction. No allies. No one to interrupt the spiral. She was alone. The plane continued forward. The clouds outside glided past the window like ghosts. Vanessa kept her breathing steady, but the damage was cumulative. Every ignored request, every whispered insult, every smirk, every dismissive tone, it all piled onto her shoulders, pressing down like invisible weight. She wanted to believe this was an isolated incident, that the system had failed and not the people. But the people were the system, and the system had shown her exactly where she stood. As the descent began, the flight attendants moved through the cabin, ensuring trays were up and seats were locked. Deborah's voice came over the speaker again, chipper and relaxed, like a host ending a pleasant dinner party. Vanessa looked down at her hands. Her fingers were steady. Her mind was not. It was about how she had dared to carry herself with dignity, how she had dared to expect the respect she was due, how she had not cowered or shrunk into invisibility. She had simply existed unapologetically, and for Deborah Hale, that was unacceptable. The flight wore on, dragging forward in long, uneasy increments. The hum of conversation continued around her, pockets of idle chatter about destinations, business meetings, hotel bookings, and connecting flights. Vanessa heard it all, absorbed it all, let it settle around her like a thick fog. The lights in the cabin dimmed slightly as the flight attendants began the second round of beverage service. Deborah appeared again, gliding down the aisle like a performance was in progress. Her voice was lighter, louder than necessary, as if she wanted everyone to hear just how delightful she could be. She reached the row in front of Vanessa and leaned in to speak with an older white man in a sports coat, exchanging pleasantries about wine preferences and travel status. The man laughed at something she said, then handed her a business card. Deborah smiled wider. "We always take care of our premium flyers," she said, her voice floating backward to Vanessa like a dart aimed at her soul. Then, without moving her feet, she tilted her head slightly toward the junior attendant who had followed behind her with the cart and said, just loud enough, "Unlike certain passengers who think they're owed something just because they bought a ticket." The words weren't directed, but they were aimed. The assistant attendant laughed quietly, then murmured, "She's been quiet though." Deborah replied, "Oh, she's simmering. You can tell. Bet she'll post about it later. Turn it into some kind of injustice thing." The laughter that followed was soft but not silent. Vanessa heard it. So did the woman in the row beside her, who shifted slightly and looked away. So did the two men across the aisle, one of whom chuckled and leaned closer to his travel partner. One of them whispered, probably playing the race card already. Vanessa's jaw tightened, but her face did not change. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She sat like a statue of patience in a room full of cracking voices and breaking dignity. The comments weren't shouted, but their impact was thunderous. She was being made a spectacle without doing a single thing to warrant it. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded restitution. She had made no accusations. And yet, they had crafted a narrative in which she was the villain, the disruptor, the fragile one who couldn't handle disappointment. They had given her a role in their unspoken story and expected her to play it without protest. The beverage cart reached her row again, and Deborah offered the man beside Vanessa a ginger ale and a bag of cookies with the same warmth she had shown up front. Then she turned to Vanessa, her eyes cool and calculated. "Would you like something?" she asked, her voice lined with false sweetness. Vanessa shook her head once. "No, thank you." Deborah shrugged and moved on without a second glance. The man beside Vanessa sipped his drink and said nothing. He did not acknowledge what had just happened, though he had heard every word from before. The flight attendant behind Deborah hesitated before stepping forward. She paused, looked at Vanessa with something that almost resembled regret, and then moved on as well. There were no heroes here. No one would step in. No one would interrupt the quiet performance of cruelty that Deborah had perfected. Vanessa stared at the back of the seat ahead of her. Her chest was tight, not with panic, not with fear, but with the weight of sustained invisibility. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from being treated as a problem simply for existing. She hadn't done anything to provoke this. She hadn't earned the mockery. But that didn't matter. For people like Deborah, the offense was baked into her presence, not her behavior. It wasn't about what Vanessa did. It was about what she represented. As the cabin lights dimmed further and the announcements resumed about estimated arrival time and weather in Chicago, Vanessa closed her eyes. She needed a moment to herself, even if it meant pretending to rest. She wasn't tired, but her body ached with restraint. Her silence had been weaponized. Her stillness twisted into perceived defiance. And now, even among dozens of passengers, she felt completely alone. The whispering around her continued, the occasional chuckle, the subtle shifts in posture when people passed by her row. The humiliation wasn't explosive. It wasn't a scene. It was steady, deliberate erosion, designed to chip away at her self-worth without ever offering an obvious incident to report. That was the brilliance of it. The cruelty was disguised as policy. The contempt was dressed in professionalism. The exclusion wore a name tag and smiled while it cut. Deborah walked past once more, this time not stopping. But her eyes met Vanessa's for a split second. There was no shame in them, no discomfort, only the smug satisfaction of someone who thought they had successfully put another woman in her place. No one leaned near her. No one made small talk. Even the man in the seat beside her, who had previously shown some sign of discomfort about Deborah's remarks, now sat stiffly angled away, face buried in his magazine like it offered some sort of moral escape. Vanessa sat composed, silent, her expression unchanged but her thoughts sharpened. She had been here before, not on this exact plane, not in this exact seat, but in this exact position. Watched, judged, diminished. And every time she told herself she wouldn't let it get to her. But every time, it chipped something away. The flight attendants began to roll out the meal carts again, this time for the mid-flight meal service. The scent of warmed bread and seasoned chicken filled the cabin as they approached, the aroma strangely comforting despite the setting. Vanessa waited, eyes forward, expecting little, but hoping for basic decency. Row by row, trays were distributed, each with a warm entree, a side salad, and a dessert cup. She watched as the cart reached the row in front of her, and 2 trays were handed over with the kind of routine ease that suggested every passenger would be served. The attendant, Deborah herself this time, reached a row, passed a tray to the man beside Vanessa, then paused. She looked down at Vanessa and gave a tight, insincere smile. "Sorry, we've run out," she said flatly. "We only had a limited count loaded." Vanessa looked at her without blinking. "You don't have any remaining meals?" Deborah gave a small shrug. "It happens sometimes. Should have ordered ahead if you had dietary restrictions." She didn't ask if Vanessa had any. She didn't check the manifest for any special requests. She didn't offer a substitute. She simply moved on. Less than 3 minutes later, Vanessa watched as Deborah handed the exact same chicken entree to a passenger 1 row behind her, another white man who hadn't pre-ordered, who hadn't even asked. He looked surprised to receive it, but accepted it without hesitation. Deborah smiled and made a small joke as she handed him a second packet of dressing. Vanessa looked straight ahead again, her jaw tight. She wasn't just being excluded. She was being erased. Slowly, strategically, in front of everyone, and yet behind the curtain of plausible professionalism. If she protested, it would be called overreaction. If she stood up for herself, she would be labeled aggressive. And that, as Vanessa would soon learn, had already been set in motion. While she sat hungry, ignored, the pilot in the cockpit was receiving a crew incident note from Deborah. On the airline's internal communication system, Deborah had quietly submitted a written message under her name as lead attendant. The entry stated that a passenger, row 27B, had been visibly agitated throughout the flight, had requested service multiple times in a demanding tone, and was showing signs of growing frustration that could be perceived as disruptive. It was phrased carefully, using the kind of corporate language designed to raise subtle alarms without making formal accusations. It was, in effect, a preemptive strike, a quiet red flag sent directly to the chain of command, ensuring that if Vanessa so much as raised her voice, she would be met with suspicion instead of support. The pilot, focused on weather patterns and arrival logistics, simply acknowledged the note. No action was taken, yet, but the seed was planted. Deborah returned to her routine with a practiced ease. She moved back through the aisles with a serene expression, joking lightly with passengers, complimenting children on their travel toys, asking frequent flyers about their next destination. She wore her professionalism like armor, polished and spotless. And Vanessa, starving and stone silent, remained the blemish she was determined to cover up. The passengers around Vanessa had begun to notice. One woman across the aisle whispered to her seatmate, glancing briefly in Vanessa's direction. A younger man 2 rows forward shifted uncomfortably when Deborah passed out extra snacks to others while bypassing Vanessa altogether. Still, no one spoke up. No one intervened. Polite society had rules, and one of them was that unless someone made a scene, everything was considered acceptable. Silence equaled peace, even when the silence was imposed by injustice. Vanessa closed her eyes for a long moment. She remembered meals at restaurants where servers had pretended not to see her, hotel check-ins where her ID was double-checked while the guests beside her sailed through, interviews where her resume earned interest until she walked into the room. And now here, on a plane in the sky, where a woman with a name tag and a job title had decided she didn't belong and was determined to make her feel it. She had said nothing, she had done nothing, and still she was labeled a threat. Deborah had weaponized the structure of service to isolate her. The service she was paid to provide was being used like a scalpel, clean, efficient, but cutting all the same. Vanessa's stomach growled softly, a physical echo of the indignity she had just endured. But she didn't move. She didn't call out. She didn't confront Deborah as she passed again with the trash bag, collecting empty trays and wrappers from those who had been served. Deborah didn't look at her, didn't even glance. That, more than anything, told Vanessa everything she needed to know. She wasn't being ignored. She was being punished for her presence, for her poise, for not shrinking when told she didn't belong. The captain's voice came over the speaker, smooth and practiced, announcing that they were preparing to begin descent into Chicago within the hour. He mentioned mild turbulence ahead and asked passengers to begin stowing belongings and preparing for landing. The seatbelt lights blinked on. Deborah made another pass, reminding passengers to secure trays and lock seatbacks. She moved with the same confidence she'd shown since boarding, unchecked and unchallenged. She reached Vanessa's row and didn't speak. She simply looked past her, straightened a seatbelt strap in the aisle seat, and moved on. Vanessa exhaled once, slowly. Her breath felt heavier than it should have, not because of altitude, because of erosion. She had not been yelled at. She had not been pushed, but she had been steadily, repeatedly, deliberately diminished. Every interaction, every omission, every slight masked as protocol had chipped away at the illusion of equality in this shared space. Deborah's carefully crafted narrative had laid traps beneath Vanessa's every movement, manipulating perception with surgical precision, using the airline's hierarchy like armor. But Vanessa had reached her threshold, not the limit of her patience, but the limit of her invisibility. She waited until the second round of trash collection was complete, until the carts had cleared, and the aisle had opened again. Then she calmly stood, adjusted her jacket, and stepped into the narrow walkway. She walked slowly toward the galley near the front, bypassing cautious glances, ignoring the whispers and stiff postures that followed her like shadows. As she reached the front, she spotted Deborah pouring black coffee into a paper cup with mechanical flair. Vanessa stopped 3 feet away and spoke with unwavering calm. "I'd like to speak with the flight manager," she said. Deborah turned slightly, her expression carefully blank. "Excuse me." Vanessa repeated herself, still quiet, her tone firm but without any trace of raised emotion. "I'd like to speak to the flight manager, please." Deborah smiled thinly. "If you have a concern, you can speak with me. I'm the lead on this flight." Vanessa's face remained unreadable. "Then I'd like to lodge a formal complaint." Deborah's mouth curled upward, not with kindness, but with condescension. "Complaints are handled after the flight. You can submit something online when we land." Vanessa didn't respond. Her silence lingered long enough to make Deborah add another line, this time with a glint in her eye that betrayed the threat beneath the customer service tone. "That is, if you're still on the flight when we land." The words sat in the air like a blade. Vanessa heard them. So did the nearby attendant silently organizing plastic cups behind Deborah. Vanessa knew exactly what the statement meant. It was a message dressed in policy, veiled, dangerous, and designed to intimidate. Still, she did not respond. She nodded once, turned, and walked calmly back to her seat. She didn't stumble. She didn't breathe faster. But her chest burned, not with anger, but with the anticipation of what was being set in motion behind her back. She sat again in row 27, eyes forward, expression neutral. But her ears, her instincts, her senses remained sharp, tuned to the movement behind the curtain. Minutes later, Deborah walked briskly to the galley in the rear of the aircraft where another flight attendant, Carly, stood organizing service supplies. Deborah leaned in close and kept her voice low, but not so low that it couldn't be overheard by a pair of passengers standing nearby waiting for the restroom. "Row 27B, Deborah said. She came up to the front, demanded the manager, and gave me attitude. Loud, aggressive, and trying to challenge procedures. "We might need to keep an eye on her." Carly nodded, a trace of uncertainty in her posture. She didn't seem loud when I walked past. Deborah cut her off. "She's been escalating all flight. I've logged the behavior in the incident report. We may need to involve security during the layover if she keeps it up. Better to be cautious." The implication was clear. Deborah was preparing the groundwork for escalation, not because there had been any disturbance, but because she was building a case, a false narrative that would frame Vanessa as the aggressor. Her calm requests, her composed posture, her silence, all twisted into imaginary confrontation. The two passengers near the restroom didn't say a word, but their eyes followed Deborah as she moved past them. The seed had been planted again. Back in her seat, Vanessa stared at the tray table in front of her. She hadn't heard the exchange, but she could feel it, the shift, the silent maneuvering. Her intuition told her exactly what was being plotted. It was always the same pattern. When a black woman demanded to be treated with fairness and clarity, her tone was rebranded as aggression. Her dignity became defiance. Her insistence on respect was reframed as hostility. It didn't matter how she spoke. Her existence challenged their order. And Deborah's expression, that smug smile paired with veiled threats, confirmed what Vanessa already knew. She was being positioned for removal. She looked out the window. The light was changing, clouds thinning, the landscape below growing sharper. The descent wasn't far off now. She imagined what the next steps would be. A quiet call to the gate. A uniformed officer waiting in the jet bridge. A list of fabricated infractions passed down from Deborah's carefully worded report. She had seen it happen before. To friends, to colleagues, to strangers whose only crime had been confidence. It would take nothing, just a nod from a pilot, a thumbs up from the purser, and a single act of showmanship from Deborah to label Vanessa as disruptive. Once labeled, she would be interrogated, delayed, possibly even barred from flying further. It would all depend on how convincing Deborah was and how complacent everyone else remained. And still, Vanessa said nothing, because she was listening. Listening for the right moment, watching the players, assessing the pattern. She wasn't afraid, not anymore, but she was angry, calm, patient, and deliberate in her anger. And it wasn't just for herself. It was for every time someone like Deborah abused their position, used policy as a weapon, and smiled while doing it. It was for every passenger who said nothing, every attendant who looked the other way, every manager who sided with convenience over truth. She folded her hands, adjusted the cuff of her blazer, and let the silence stretch. Across the aisle, the woman who had been watching earlier now sat uncomfortably, glancing occasionally at Vanessa, as if recognizing, too late, that the situation had shifted from cold service to targeted aggression. The overhead chime dinged. The pilot's voice returned, announcing descent. Vanessa didn't look up. She knew the descent was only physical. The fall that Deborah was setting up had nothing to do with altitude. It was a tactic as old as the profession. A quiet signal to the cockpit, a falsified incident note, and a message sent ahead to airport security. Vanessa had seen it before. She had studied hundreds of these interactions. She had read every documented abuse of discretion, every coded term used in reports that twisted ordinary behavior into justification for removal. She had watched how confidence was reframed as defiance, how silence was repackaged as suspicious, and how calm objection could be weaponized into disruption. Her fingers remained steady as she unbuckled her seatbelt. The plane came to a stop, a soft jolt as the landing gear locked into place. Chimes sounded. Passengers reached up to open overhead bins. The crowd shifted and rustled with the familiar impatience of arrival. Yet in the middle of that movement, Deborah Hale stepped into the aisle near the front of the plane with the confidence of someone about to finish a performance she believed she had controlled from start to finish. Her voice was neutral, practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while we assist a passenger with a special deplaning procedure." The words were vague but unmistakable in meaning. Several passengers looked toward the rear. Others straightened in their seats, curious. A woman across the aisle narrowed her eyes slightly, already guessing who the announcement concerned. Deborah walked down the aisle slowly, pausing at row 27, standing beside Vanessa's seat. "Ms. Brooks," she said with clipped formality, "please wait until the cabin is clear. Security will be meeting you at the jet bridge to discuss concerns filed during the flight." Her words were careful, spoken loud enough for at least 3 rows in each direction to hear. Vanessa didn't respond immediately. She reached into her carry-on, unzipped a small inner compartment, and retrieved a black leather wallet no larger than a passport. Her movements were calm, deliberate, unbothered. She stood up slowly, her height and poise casting a quiet authority over the nearby seats. Deborah's brows raised slightly, confusion creeping into her face. Vanessa opened the wallet and held it out so that both Deborah and the nearby passengers could see the gold-plated badge on the left and the federal identification on the right. FAA Lead Compliance Officer, U.S. Department of Transportation. Her voice was clear and unshaken. "I'm FAA Lead Compliance Officer Vanessa Brooks. This flight was selected for an unannounced en-route service integrity audit. I've completed my documentation, but your behavior and decisions throughout the flight have been recorded and submitted for departmental review." Deborah's face froze. She blinked once, lips parting as if to speak but unable to find a response. Her posture stiffened, the professional mask faltering under the weight of what she had just heard. Vanessa's tone never rose. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She spoke as if delivering an executive summary. "You denied me my assigned seat without cause, submitted a falsified report to the cockpit identifying me as potentially disruptive, denied me meal service while others were served, publicly mocked me to your colleague and passengers, and made threatening statements suggesting removal from the flight, all without provocation, in full violation of Title 14 CFR Part 121 and Departmental Non-Discrimination Policy." The nearby passengers who had chuckled, whispered, or pretended not to hear earlier were now utterly silent. Deborah's assistant, Carly, stood halfway down the aisle with wide eyes, a tray of cups shaking slightly in her hand. A man seated 2 rows back, who had laughed earlier, now stared at the badge like it might bite him. Vanessa continued, her tone still controlled. "I did not identify myself earlier because our office monitors authentic passenger treatment and behavior when staff believe no accountability is present. You've demonstrated multiple breaches of conduct and judgment, which will be submitted in full, including recorded witness statements, verbal documentation, and procedural failures." Deborah swallowed hard. "I didn't know," she said quietly. Vanessa met her eyes. That was the point. Deborah's face had drained of color, and her voice, no longer confident, dropped to a whisper. "I thought you were just," but she stopped, unable to finish. Vanessa waited not to hear the excuse, but to make it clear that excuses would not undo the damage. Passengers began to whisper now, but not about her. Their murmurs were different, heavier. They were talking about what they had seen, about what had just been revealed. A woman across the aisle who had watched the treatment unfold sat frozen, lips parted slightly in guilt. One of the male passengers leaned to his friend and muttered, "Damn." The atmosphere had shifted. No longer was Vanessa the silent, mysterious woman being passed over and insulted. She was now the one with authority, the one with truth, the one who had allowed the entire performance to unfold just long enough to document it. Deborah stepped back as if physically stung, her eyes flicking to Carly, then to the front of the plane. Her confidence collapsed, the authority she had wielded so smugly for the last 4 hours evaporating in the span of seconds. Vanessa remained standing, not as a victor, not in revenge, but in clarity. She hadn't come on the flight looking for retribution. She had come to do her job. But what Deborah had given her was something far more revealing than an audit could manufacture. She had exposed herself. Every decision, every comment, every failure had been her own. The lead attendant had sabotaged herself in real time, unaware that the woman she tried to diminish was the very person responsible for holding her accountable. Vanessa's badge remained in her hand as she addressed the nearby passengers. The department encourages anyone who witnessed inappropriate or discriminatory service to submit statements through the official FAA reporting channel. Your names and details will not be required. Integrity in flight operations depends on accountability and truth. Then she turned to Deborah one final time. You may inform security there's no need for an escort. I'll be walking out freely. You'll be hearing from my office soon. With that, Vanessa turned and stepped into the aisle, walking down it with the same quiet composure she had shown while boarding. But now the weight behind her steps carried authority. Eyes followed her, not in judgment now, but in realization. The very assumptions that had allowed Deborah to feel superior had crumbled. She had already said enough. And more importantly, she had shown enough. At the end of the corridor, two airline supervisors stood stiffly near the open gate, arms crossed and radios clipped to their shoulders. Their posture was braced for confrontation, prepared to face the kind of incident the lead flight attendant had clearly suggested might be coming. But what they found instead was a woman composed, professional, and utterly unshaken. Vanessa approached them without pause. She reached into her jacket pocket, withdrew her badge wallet again, and opened it with practiced ease. The gold insignia gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights. Vanessa Brooks, she said clearly, FAA Lead Compliance Officer, Division of In-Flight Operations. I'm conducting a covert audit under Protocol E212. Your gate was flagged for integrity review and unannounced service conduct evaluation. The two supervisors blinked. One quickly adjusted his earpiece. The other leaned forward slightly to inspect the badge, his mouth opening in surprise. Vanessa didn't stop. I have completed my passenger side documentation. However, your lead flight attendant, Deborah Hale, demonstrated a sustained pattern of misconduct, including seat reassignment without cause, verbal threats of removal, falsified behavior reports, discriminatory treatment, and intentional service denial. Her conduct also included audible mockery of a passenger within public hearing range and manipulation of internal procedures to isolate and intimidate. One of the supervisors raised a hand slightly. Ma'am, Officer Brooks, I wasn't made aware this flight had an assigned compliance observer. Vanessa's eyes did not waver. That is the nature of this audit. The Department of Transportation approves field observation without prior crew notification to ensure the authenticity of interactions and compliance with civil aviation standards. The second supervisor, a tall man with a clipboard tucked beneath his arm, straightened. Do you need us to intervene at this time? Vanessa nodded once. Yes. Deborah Hale and the attendants assigned to her service team must remain on the aircraft. They are not to disembark until instructed. I am requesting full crew statements and copies of in-flight logs before I leave this terminal. An official review will be initiated within 24 hours, and internal airline compliance will be copied on the case. Behind her, the first few passengers began stepping out of the jet bridge, cautiously filing into the terminal. Their faces carried traces of recognition, realization, and discomfort. The story had shifted. The woman they had watched endure quiet humiliation without a word had become the authority they couldn't ignore. Deborah was not visible yet. She remained inside the aircraft, likely gathering herself, attempting to reconcile what had just unfolded and what it now meant. Vanessa turned to one of the supervisors. Please ensure all communications between Deborah Hale and cockpit personnel are preserved. The incident note she submitted during flight contains misrepresentations and will be compared to video and testimonial evidence. The supervisor nodded quickly and tapped his earpiece, relaying instructions. Vanessa stood silently for a moment, allowing them to process. Her presence was no longer just one of correction, it was enforcement. And it carried the weight of accountability. Passengers emerging from the aircraft began to pause briefly as they passed. Some nodded. One woman, who had sat across from Vanessa during the flight and had said nothing at the time, now stopped and spoke just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I saw everything. She treated you like garbage. I should have said something. I'm sorry." Vanessa met her eyes and simply replied, "Thank you. If you're willing, please submit a statement. It doesn't have to be formal. The truth is enough." The woman nodded and moved on, eyes downcast. Another man, younger, dressed in business casual with earbuds around his neck, stepped beside her and added, "If you want a witness statement, I can vouch for everything." She was out of line the entire flight. Vanessa turned toward the terminal check-in counter, where two other airport staff members had now gathered, alerted by the supervisor's chatter. One of them recognized her title and began pulling up documentation protocols on their screen. Deborah still hadn't emerged. Inside the aircraft, Vanessa knew she was probably trying to reshape the narrative, scrambling to remember how many passengers had overheard her, how many jokes she had made to her team, how many decisions she had made that now stood as evidence against her. Carly and the rest of the flight crew were trapped in the same shared silence, the kind that always follows the collapse of assumed power. Vanessa turned back toward the plane, her voice crisp, but still devoid of triumph. "Please inform the captain that the audit will include a review of procedural knowledge, report handling, and crew communication. Cooperation is expected." The supervisor nodded again. "Understood." Another chime sounded from the gate intercom. Deborah finally stepped into the jet bridge, eyes wide, her previously confident posture now replaced with tight shoulders and darting glances. She spotted Vanessa immediately. Her mouth opened. "I wasn't trying to." Vanessa cut her off without raising her voice. "Please remain inside the aircraft. You'll be interviewed after the logbook and internal communications are copied. Anything you say now will be added to the report." Deborah hesitated, then stepped back silently. No smugness now, no clever comments, no contempt, just the cold, raw understanding that the rules she had so freely manipulated had turned against her. Vanessa watched her retreat, then turned to the gathering of terminal staff. "I'll need a private room to conduct final documentation. Please have IT preserve internal Wi-Fi logs. The passenger manifest will also be requested, anonymized if necessary." A nearby attendant rushed to comply. Everything around her now moved with deference. Not fear, but respect. The kind Deborah had believed was reserved only for herself. Vanessa didn't speak again until she reached the designated terminal room where her laptop was handed off and secure access provided. As she sat down and began entering data, she reflected on every moment of the flight, not with emotion, but with precision. Her notes would be reviewed by both FAA legal and interagency compliance, and every sentence she wrote now would ensure that the truth was recorded in permanent ink. She walked through the halls with a practiced grace, but this time there was no light banter from passing colleagues, no friendly nods from fellow crew members. The smiles were gone, replaced by hushed glances and unreadable expressions. Something had shifted. She knew at the moment she stepped inside. The assistant at the front desk did not offer a greeting. Instead, she pointed toward a side conference room with a single nod, eyes quickly returning to her screen. Deborah entered and found two people already seated, a compliance officer from the airline's internal legal team and a representative from FAA Administrative Liaison. There was no warmth in their voices when they asked her to sit. They did not offer coffee. They did not ask how her flight had gone. They opened the meeting with a formal reading of the complaint and outlined that she had been placed on administrative suspension pending outcome of a multi-agency review. Deborah sat stunned for a moment, lips parted, unable to reconcile the authority she had once wielded in the air with a sterile, formal tone now directed at her like a loaded weapon. The compliance officer read from the documentation filed by FAA Lead Compliance Officer Vanessa Brooks, citing multiple violations of passenger rights, false internal reporting, discriminatory conduct, and failure to adhere to standard service protocols. Each violation was listed with timestamps, supporting witness statements, and audio excerpts captured from cabin interactions. Deborah tried to interrupt once, raising a hand. That woman, she didn't tell anyone who she was. She just sat there like she wanted to be offended. The FAA representative responded coldly. That woman's identity wasn't the problem. Your conduct was. Deborah's voice faltered. I didn't mean to, but the words withered under the glare of the documentation spread before her. Passengers had submitted reports overnight, some voluntarily reaching out through the FAA's official online portal, others sharing their accounts on social media. A viral post on a travel forum titled, "This is what flying while black looks like," included a detailed account of what occurred in row 27, written by a woman who had witnessed the meal denial and recorded the whispered insults. Another traveler, a former corporate attorney, posted a thread outlining the difference between poor service and targeted mistreatment, citing Deborah's behavior as a case study in bias-driven abuse of authority. A grainy photo, likely captured during the flight, showed Vanessa mid-walk in the aisle, her posture composed, her expression neutral, and her badge clearly visible in her hand. The image had been retweeted thousands of times with captions like the calmest mic drop in airline history, and she let them finish their act, then closed the curtain herself. The airline's public relations team scrambled to manage the damage. By noon, they had issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging an active investigation into an incident involving a federal compliance officer and one of our in-flight teams. The release expressed commitment to inclusivity and service excellence, but stopped short of admitting fault. Deborah read the statement from her phone while sitting alone in the back of the HR holding area, waiting for her paperwork. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from disbelief. She had spent years believing herself untouchable, protected by policy, shielded by her uniform. Now, the same rules she had used to isolate and belittle passengers were being applied to her with unflinching precision. At the same time, internal memos circulated across the airline's employee portal, reminding all staff of the core tenets of respectful service, non-discrimination, and accurate reporting. Department heads were instructed to hold emergency briefings with all crew members, using the Vanessa Brooks case as a scenario-based training tool. The message was clear. What had once been tolerated in silence would no longer be ignored. Across the industry, other flight crews began talking. Vanessa's name carried a new kind of gravity. Not fear, but respect. She hadn't threatened. She hadn't raised her voice. She had allowed the behavior to unfold exactly as it always had. But this time, she was watching and documenting, and that more than anything, shattered the illusion that these behaviors were harmless. Vanessa herself remained silent in the aftermath. She did not give interviews. She did not release statements. She didn't respond to the dozens of media requests forwarded to her office. Instead, she continued her work, logged the necessary follow-up documentation, and prepared her final report for submission to both the Department of Transportation and the airline's Corporate Oversight Board. She let the facts speak, and they did, loudly. Deborah's suspension became the subject of industry-wide discussion. Pilots, gate agents, and even senior-level customer service executives were briefed on the findings, reminded that noncompliance and personal bias were no longer invisible sins. Deborah's team was also questioned. Carly, the junior attendant, broke down during her interview, admitting that she had witnessed the mistreatment but felt too intimidated to intervene. She confessed to hearing Deborah's mocking comments and to witnessing her fabricate the behavior report sent to the cockpit. Her testimony matched that of 2 other attendants and at least 6 passenger statements. Deborah's pattern had been exposed. Her words, once whispered, now roared in official transcripts. There were no denials left, only consequences. And yet, even now, Vanessa felt no vindictive joy. She didn't need Deborah to suffer. She needed the system to be honest. She needed the structure that allowed quiet cruelty to be rebuilt with the same discipline it once used to ignore it. So she continued her work. She moved on to the next case. She carried her badge not as a threat, but as a promise. A promise that even when no one else was watching, someone eventually would be. Time passed slowly for Deborah Hale in the weeks following her suspension, not because the days were long, but because they were quiet in a way she had never experienced. The rhythm of takeoffs and landings, the orchestrated cadence of in-flight announcements and service checklists, had been replaced by the mechanical repetition of desk work deep within the airline's crew scheduling department. The walls were gray, the lighting fluorescent, and the interactions stilted and brief. No one called her Deb anymore. No one asked her about the last city she'd flown to. Her name had become a cautionary whisper. Her badge, once worn like a medal, now stayed clipped in her drawer. She came in early, left late, and spent most of her days staring at flight rosters, scheduling changes, and reports she used to ignore. She had once believed herself indispensable. She had once believed her experience protected her. Now she moved carefully, speaking little, the memory of her downfall wrapped around her like a second skin. The investigation had closed quietly. The FAA report had been blunt, precise, and merciless in its detail. Vanessa's words, clipped and professional, had filled paragraph after paragraph with timelines, witness accounts, corroborated testimonies, and audio transcripts. Deborah had read every word. She had seen her own behavior dissected line by line, not with anger or exaggeration, but with truth so plain it cut deeper than any reprimand. There had been no public termination. The airline had chosen reassignment over dismissal, an opportunity to change, to learn, to demonstrate growth. Deborah knew she had been spared the worst because she had not doubled down, had not denied what had happened. She had confessed to parts of it, admitted more when presented with recordings, and accepted the conditions of her reassignment without protest. And yet, the consequences had followed her in other ways. Old colleagues avoided her. Some were polite but distant. Others offered looks of quiet disappointment that spoke more than any formal reprimand. The uniform she had once worn with pride now hung untouched in the back of her closet, the fabric stiff with disuse. Every morning she walked past it, the reflection in her mirror reminding her that the woman who had worn it was not the same one who now sat behind a desk, trying to learn humility in silence. It had been 5 months when she saw Vanessa again. She hadn't known the compliance team, was visiting headquarters, until her manager forwarded an email about a mandatory integrity seminar hosted by FAA field agents. Deborah hadn't read the full attachment. She had glanced at the time, made a note to attend, and walked into the room at the scheduled hour, expecting another generic training session filled with policies she had already memorized. But the moment she saw Vanessa standing near the screen, reviewing presentation slides, the breath caught in her chest. There was no badge on display this time, no dramatic reveal, no uniform of federal authority. Just Vanessa Brooks in a sharp, understated Navy suit, speaking softly to the training coordinator. Her presence was calm, precise, and unmistakable. Deborah stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, uncertain whether to enter or turn away. But eventually, she stepped inside and took a seat near the back. The presentation began without ceremony. Vanessa introduced herself, outlined the purpose of the session, and walked through real case studies of in-flight misconduct and structural bias. She never mentioned her own case. She never pointed fingers. Her tone remained steady, her examples clinical, each story a mirror held up to the industry itself. Deborah listened, heart thudding in her chest, not because she expected to be called out, but because she knew every word applied to her more than anyone else in that room. Vanessa spoke of small decisions made at 30,000 feet that could reshape a person's dignity for years. She described the responsibility of crew members to protect passengers, not just their safety, but their humanity. She ended with a single statement, quiet but unshakable. Power in the skies is still power. If we don't treat it like a responsibility, it becomes a weapon. The seminar ended. People clapped. The room began to empty. Deborah remained seated until most of the attendees had left. Then she stood slowly, walked forward, and stopped a few feet from the woman whose silence had once condemned her far more effectively than any courtroom. Vanessa looked up, recognition in her eyes, but no surprise. Deborah's mouth was dry. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Officer Brooks, I don't expect you to say anything. I needed to say I was wrong." She paused, searching for the right words. Not because of what happened after. Not because of the report. Because of what I did. What I said. I knew better. And I still chose the easy way. I still chose to see you the way I was trained to see people who didn't fit my comfort zone. Vanessa didn't reply immediately. She listened, face unreadable. Deborah kept going. "I've thought about that flight every day. I've read your report more times than I can count. I just needed you to hear from me. Not an excuse. Just the truth." A long silence followed, the kind that felt like it could stretch into something heavier. Vanessa finally nodded, once. "Thank you for saying it." Then she turned, collected her materials, and walked away. She didn't offer forgiveness. She didn't need to. Her acknowledgement was enough. Deborah stood there for a moment longer, watching her go. She didn't feel redeemed, but she felt something else, something that had eluded her for years. Accountability, not the kind handed down in disciplinary meetings, but the kind that lingers in the heart when the mirror refuses to lie. Deborah returned to her desk that afternoon and didn't speak about the seminar to anyone. But when she pulled up the crew roster to approve next week's flight rotations, she paused. She found the name of a junior attendant who had filed a complaint once about another supervisor and had been dismissed as oversensitive. She flagged the file, attached a note, and marked it for follow-up. Later that week, she met with the scheduling lead and asked to review the process for handling conflict reports. She didn't frame it as reform. She just said, "I think we can do better." And in small steps, she began to change. Not all at once, not in headlines, but in quiet choices made when no one was watching. She would never forget Vanessa's face. Not because it haunted her, but because it reminded her that respect isn't owed to titles or uniforms. It's owed to humanity itself. And when given too late, it must be given without expectation. Just because it's right. The skies were still flying, planes still lifting off and touching down, and somewhere on a flight she would never board again, someone like Vanessa might still be sitting in seat 27B, quietly waiting to see what the crew would do when they thought no one important was watching. The end. If this story made you think, pause, or feel something real, consider supporting with a like and subscribing for more powerful narratives rooted in truth, tension, and justice. What did you think of the plot? Did any moment hit harder than you expected? Which scene stood out the most? I'd love to hear where you're watching or reading from. Drop a comment and share your thoughts, especially how you felt about the shift in power and the final confrontation. Your reactions help shape what comes next.